Hello, hi, I am Allison Posey. Here, we'll make this a little more formal. I work at CAST, where the Universal Design for Learning framework was developed about 30 years, 25 years ago. And it's been really an amazing ride to get to work with educators from across the country on how we can implement Universal Design for Learning to try to develop more equitable, inclusive classrooms. And given all that has happened in 2020, oh my goodness, it's just been a journey, as I know you all have had in 2020 as well. And as we look to the fall, we thought that it would be really interesting to focus in on thinking about ways that we can foster student expression and communication. So this is just one of the UDL guidelines. It doesn't matter if you've ever heard of UDL before, no worries if you haven't. But if you have, you'll hear a lot of UDL language embedded throughout this, and we'll give an explicit call out. Here's a link to the slides, which let me make sure you all can access the slides. So that's in the chat box. And if you prefer to use your device, you can just scan, hit camera and scan the little QR code, and you can pull it up on your device, which is quite fun to do sometimes. See all your slides in miniature. And I don't know how many of you recently, I went out to dinner for the first time on this rooftop outdoor place, and all of the menus now had QR codes. And these are amazing for instruction. So it's funny, for years, I guess it's been about 2.5 years since I discovered QR codes, and they're fabulous because especially with young kids, you don't have to type in the links and all of the, you just scan and it comes up on your device, or I think iPads work well. And you get right to where you need very quickly. So feel free to already integrate that into your practice. So our goals for today are to brainstorm strategies to support students to develop as expert learners in terms of how they express and communicate. So I am just curious to hear if you have anything that any burning questions or thoughts or concerns as you're planning for the fall in terms of thinking about how students can express and communicate, whether you're in a classroom context or whether you're in this hybrid or some kind of remote. Do you have anything you want to focus on? What are your goals for today? So I'll give you a moment either to share that or to reflect on that privately on your own. And you can use the chat box. There is a Twitter, this SCO Disrupt and Cast PL, if for those of you who are Twitter folks and you want to kind of be in this UDL community or that SCO Disrupt community. So I'll give you a moment to just reflect on your goals and what you hope to learn in the next 45 minutes. These are giving students a voice, especially students who are quiet. So you might not know it from me now, but I am actually incredibly shy and introverted. And as a kid, I was described as painfully shy. And I remember one time the teacher at the start of the year asked every kid to go around and give one adjective about themselves. And I wanted to use the word intrepid, but I didn't know if it was a word. So I kind of paused and I was like, and the kid behind me goes, just say shy. And I was like, oh, it made me so mad that that's how I was known. And because I needed a little more processing time, and I really do clam up when I'm called upon, I was seen as shy and often sometimes like I didn't know what was going on or a little clueless. So in a lot of ways, this thinking about options for different ways that we express and communicate is really of interest to me. And not too long ago, I was invited to go present in Lithuania. And as you probably can already tell, I move around a lot and gesticulate a lot with my arms. And I was told, actually, that's really not appreciated. And could you really try to not use your arms so much and not move around so much? And I realized how much I rely on my own physical body expression. Some of you are nodding, to be able to communicate. And in these remote times, I'm even more like, how can I communicate? Wanting that kind of three-dimensional space with my learners, whether they're adults or kiddos. And so I love that I'm seeing nods and you're relating to this. So it is amazing how different communication can be depending on that context. And you might like to know, I actually put very clanky bracelets on my wrist to remind me not to move around so much when I was presenting over there, just to really try to be respectful of the different contexts and what was considered distracting or not. I love this. I feel like a 2D dancing monkey sometimes. This is just so great. All right, so let's jump in. And I kind of already have said some of this. There are so many ways we communicate. And if you even just look up animal communication, I saw this picture of a pig and I thought, I am reading something out of that. There are just so many ways we communicate. And one of the trickiest things, something that I've learned from brain science that's so important, I think, for us to remember, is that our expressions and our body language, that's learned. There's not a universal happy or universal sad. That has been disproven in the last couple of decades. And so depending on your culture and depending on your background, you're going to emote differently. And so we might think, like I might look at you right now and I might think I understand how Bethany is thinking or feeling right now. I'm seeing her smile and I'm thinking I'm understanding that, but odds are we don't. And this came really clear to me not too long ago with both of my kids. So I have two kiddos. I mean, like every human, they're very different. And we were visiting Niagara Falls. I don't know if any of you have visited Niagara Falls before, but there's this part where you get to go underneath. It's called the Cave of the Wind. And it's really, you're in raincoats and you're pretty much under the falls. And it's fantastic, but it is sensory overload. And my son, so I am going to get up and move a little bit here. My son basically hovered over like this and walked really, really slowly. He hates water, he hates swimming, and I'm thinking he's miserable. My daughter, on the other hand, hardly wears the raincoat. She's like, "Rah!" And I'm thinking she's having a really good time. And we get to the end, and we had extra time, and we were able to do one thing, we had time to go do one more thing, and both kids wanted to do that again. They both said that was their favorite thing. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, so here's my son, who I have known his entire life, and I can't even read his verbal body language. How can I possibly read a classroom or dozens of people, let alone now on screens, right? So there have been a lot of attempts to really try to say, here's what body language is, and here are different ways for us to express and communicate. I'm using more and more emojis, and I realize actually I often misunderstand emojis. For the first little bit, I thought a thumbs up was kind of sarcastic, like, okay. But I had to clarify, and actually I realized, no, that's a good thing. That's like Fonzie, from Happy Days, good things. So really making sure we pause to understand some of the different ways that we communicate and what they mean can be really important, especially when we think of starting out the school year, potentially with students who we don't know. I've known my son for 19 years, my daughter for 16. These might be new students for us who we want to make sure we're understanding different ways that they communicate with us. And I just thought I'd share this, and I'll put this link in the chat to just show you an example. So this is something called the BioMotion Lab. And just from 15 dots, what do you think this is? And you can just put in the chat what you think this is. This is 15 dots. Yeah, it's a body, exactly. It's a human. And what's super interesting is you can kind of tell it's walking, right? It's walking. I love that some of you were thinking different things, right? Right there, we're perceiving things differently. A mushroom, a tree, an arrow, yes. So this is actually representing a human. And what's interesting is this place is trying to get at gender, weight, and even get to some emotional pieces like nervousness and happiness. So you can see, like, this is the way they're representing a male. This is the way they're representing a female. I mean, I don't know about you all. I am a female. I don't think I walk this way. It was kind of interesting to think of the generalizations that are going into this. And even looking at nervousness, like let's say I'm a nervous female. And I'm nervous, but I'm happy because I'm about to talk with some folks here at this conference. Woohoo! And this is like how I might be walking. So we're trying, right? We're trying to get better at communicating and expressing ourselves, but we run the risk of overgeneralizing and incorrectly perceiving and understanding what's going on. And especially when we think about students and their learning, we really need to be careful about this and provide flexible ways for them to be able to communicate and express themselves. And if you'll humor me for one more quick story about my family, I again kind of hit this came loud and clear to me. One time we were at Monkey Trunks. So do you have a place like this out near you that's a big obstacle course? And you rope in, you climb all around, and then at the end there was this huge zip line. Well, when we went there, my son was about 10, and no, he was 12. My son was 12, and he gets to the end of the zip line, and there was no one there to get him out of the harness. So he pretty much was stuck down there. And I was waiting at the other end and didn't know where he was, didn't know where the guy was like, don't worry, there's always someone there. And there wasn't someone there. So he was left there for about 10 minutes. And when he got off, there was no happiness. Like, even though he had had fun, I'm like, he was angry. And I like to communicate and verbalize and talk about it, but it was clear he did not want to talk about it. But what he started to do in the car, he just got in a phone, he started to text me. And he started to text me how he was feeling and how he was thinking. And I'm sitting in the passenger seat, he's sitting right behind me. And I'm thinking again, like, oh, he doesn't want to talk. The verbal means of communication is not what he needs right now. He needs to be able to have this option for expression. And thank goodness it's there, or I would have gotten nothing from him. So all of a sudden there, I had these UDL moments, Universal Design for Learning moment of thinking, this is why it's so critical that we have alternate forms of being able to communicate and express. So I thought I would pause here after these stories and kind of this introduction and see if anything's resonating with you, or if you just want to share anything, if you have any questions, just at this little story kickoff here.
Allison, there is a few questions in the chat, and I think people have been kind of responding through there if you want to take a
Great. Yes, and you have over 20 plus humans, and they only get like 1/20th of you. So yeah, it's really hard to know, and we need to know. We're not going to be able to visually always know what's going on. So coming up with some sort of group norm. And I know you have dozens of these strategies, even like the red cup for I'm stuck, the green cup for everything's okay, the yellow cup for maybe come by, coming up with some way of being able to visually communicate with each other how we're doing, how we're progressing in our work. And even more so as someone, online, what can be those nonverbal ways of communicating with each other and saying, you know what, I need a little help right now, or I need to take a break right now, a bio break, or whatever those are, establishing those norms from the beginning. And maybe it's having little little post-it notes or something that you can put up by your screen that could be different colors. Maybe drop those off at everyone's home. Thinking about the different ways to even say what. So now in Zoom, let me see if I can find it down at the bottom. Oh, it's not coming up for me this time. Zoom had actually added some emojis in as well. Are you all able to see on your screen? Is there an option for you to have reactions, I think they're called?
And there's even more in the settings. You have to go deep into the settings. You can turn them on. And it's actually coded as non-verbal communication. Yes, no, colors, and more emojis.
So play with that for a moment. Elise just posted one, which is awesome. Thank you for saying that verbally. And even sharing, like, this is what these will mean. Like, let's talk together about when do we want to use them. Oh, I just got a thumbs up from Elizabeth. And we probably could say, this is, oh, and Cliff is giving an applause. So even though I don't see Cliff's face, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's some communication there going on, which is oddly rewarding in these online times when you just don't know. Like, Cliff could be taking a nap, but then the fact that there's that little applause there, there's something there. There's something there. And I see there's this note, just as an education specialist, how do we help gen ed teachers understand this? It's critical for us now. One of the things we're finding, like an odd benefit that's coming from COVID, is this understanding of flexible means, flexible options to be able to express and communicate. It's essential now. We have to know who can't access. We have to know who's checked out, for what reasons and why. So in an odd way, we are getting, there is some good that could come from this. Great. And really thinking about variability in communication. One of my favorite examples is there was a man named Paul Smith who passed away of old age in 2000. So he was from the 1900s, way back, remember that century. And he wanted to be an artist, but he had cerebral palsy, and he had a teacher who said, you can't hold a paintbrush, so give up on that dream. And the typewriter came out. And I put a link in the slides in the notes section. There's a video you can watch about him. He created unbelievable artwork with the typewriter. And this is kind of a close-up of the way he used the different keystrokes to be able to paint and express himself. And he describes how amazing it was when colored ink came out for the typewriter, that he could actually insert color into it. We have so much technology right now at our fingertips. To not use it just seems like we are doing our students a disservice. And I understand it can be distracting. I have a hard time. There's a new game that I discovered, and it's all I can do sometimes to self-regulate and not go on and try to get a little further. But that is a really important skill for us to learn, especially when you think of all the advantages to being able to express and communicate and access information, and putting cell phones in cell phone jail. We really need to think about what is the goal for that, and what are we really scaffolding our students to be able to do? Because what if Stephen Hawking, the theoretical physicist, didn't have access to a switch for his cheek muscle, one of the last muscles that was functioning for him? What if we couldn't get at what was in his mind because the barrier was in the means of communicating? And how often do we require of our students one mode of communicating, whether it's verbal or written? I think those are the two main ones. And it's not that we don't want skills, we don't want to develop these skills in students. We absolutely do. But does it always have to be the default? Because for a student who may have trouble expressing themselves in written format, or a student like I was who was terrified to speak out loud, if that is always the only way you're asked to do something or show what you know, over time, you just start to shut down. If you don't know the language well, there's just a lot of variability that could go on to make those means of communication be barriers. And so just to kind of highlight this, for a moment, I thought I would just ask you to, and some of you if may have done this before, but just take a moment and write your name with your dominant hand. You can write it in the air, you could write it on a piece of paper that you may have, and just write your name with your dominant hand. And then try it with your non-dominant hand. And then try it with another part of your body, like maybe, stick it behind your ear or in your tongue, or like under your neck, or, in your knee or something. And compare your dominant with the other part of the body. How does it feel to know how to do something, but not to be able to show it? Right? What if you had to always communicate in that trickier space? That's what it's like for some students, on some days or always. And when does this happen for you? Think of times when this has happened for you, when you shut down in terms of communication. And when does it typically happen for your students? And as you get students, and this happened through the spring, and this happens with me with adults, and all of a sudden, the screen goes up and they disappear and you just don't know where they're going. One of the things you can think about, it's not going to be the only thing, but one could be, do they have multiple ways to communicate with me and express what they're maybe hearing, processing, learning, care about, is there more than one way? And this is where UDL comes in. So just as a quick poll, because I don't want to review too much, how familiar are you with Universal Design for Learning? And if you could just put a 1 if you're not even sure what the U, the D, and the L stand for, which is totally fine. 2 if you know a little. 3 if you're starting to apply it. And 4 if you're like, oh my gosh, been there, done that, I do them like in it all the time. And like we might have guessed, look, there's variability. Look at the variability, right? We could have anticipated this, which is fabulous. Okay, good. So for those of you who are a little more familiar, I'm going to do a very quick overview of UDL, and I invite you to share some of what your big takeaways about UDL are in the chat, so folks can have multiple representations and from multiple voice about what UDL is. So basically, Universal Design for Learning is this framework. It's like a big framework, and sometimes I don't even like to show this chart because it seems to have so much in it, that really is focusing on understanding what we know about the learning brain. So you see these little brains in the UDL framework. And the goal is to reframe barriers to be in the design of the environment, not in the student. So instead of saying Allison is shy and quiet, what's wrong? We gotta fix her. UDL is going to challenge us to say, there's a barrier in the way students can express and share. What could be a flexible way that we could get Allison and other students to express and communicate and share? And notice how huge that subtle reframing is. Because you go from the problem being in the student, who we have to fix, and the student feeling like they have something wrong with them that has to be fixed, to the barrier being in the often inflexible means of communicating, that we are then empowered to think about how we can reduce that barrier. So Allison, if your barrier is verbally communicating in class, and I want to know a little more about what you're thinking, what could be some options that could help us? Right there, that empowers the student. That empowers you as the educator, the parent, or the caregiver you may be working with to come up with some different options. And whatever you develop or come up with for me, just make it available to the whole class. So it's not just for that one, Allison over there, but it's for learning, and it's about communicating, and it's about the whole class for everyone. But you really need to make sure you know the learning goal. That's so critical for UDL, because if the goal is to verbally speak, then we want to support that. But if the goal is just to communicate, then we can be more flexible. So we really have to make sure we know the learning goal with UDL. But the idea is that we're really trying to reframe barriers to be in the environment and empower students to build the strategies and tools they need to focus on what we call desirable difficulties. Like, what's the goal? What do we really want to get them to do? And so to think about that, UDL thinks about, well, what are some options we can use to engage learners? What are different ways we could build background? And what are different ways students can show what they know? So we kind of break down learning by these 3 huge domains that happen to align with the learning brain. So I'll pause there and see if there are questions. If anyone else wants to chime in some other ideas of what UDL is for them, what it means for them. And that was, you know, one of the quickest probably overviews of UDL, but hopefully captured some of the big key ideas of it. So yes, Tracy, you're inviting kids into the conversation. You're kind of breaking open the learning process. Yep, yep. And sometimes they don't always offer, you know, choices that may be in service of productive learning, and that's such a powerful conversation to have. Yes, different seating options. So, you know, a story I remember is a student and their parents had to fight, took a couple years to be able to get a standing desk in the classroom. And then that student was the standing desk student. But it didn't have to be that way, right? There could have been flexible options in the design of the environment from the beginning that any student could use. And when they need to stand, like right now at home, I would say we have a lot more flexibility. If I need to stand, I can stand. If I need to sit, I can sit. If I need to sprawl out on the floor, I can do that. I have a little bit more of a flexible learning space here. And it actually helps me learn better when I can physically move around and I'm not just focusing on sit down and sit still. So that was a great example, Jackie. Yep. Seating options can be a flexibility. And Michelle, what's ELD?
English language development.
Oh,
Right?
development.
I'm
Great.
just feeling, I'm noticing like the kind of just trend in multiple sort of branches of education about coming from an assets base as opposed to a deficits base, right? Like,
Yes.
what does the family bring? What does the child bring? What do we bring? Building on those strengths as opposed to always focused on what's not working.
Yes, that's so well said. And UDL, you'll find, aligns well with so many different frameworks, SEL, culturally relevant pedagogy, PBIS. UDL actually works best in conjunction with frameworks. UDL is going to really frame learning in terms of the learning brain and these three broad principles, but we're thinking about goals, ultimately, UBD. Awesome. Anyone want to add any? Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Sorry, well, I'm unmuted. Can I just ask, the one thing that I think I struggle with is when we make all of these options available for ourselves and for students, you know, where is that intersection? I mean, I'm asking an art, not a science question, that intersection with, you know, what you need to access the content is going to be a profound distraction for me. Do you know what I mean? So
Yes.
like, I guess I don't even know if there's an answer except that you have to just finesse it on a case by case, but that feels like a tension point, you know?
It does. So here's the framing that can be consistent. When it's about the learning goal and in service of the learning, then it's really kind of fair game to talk about. And one of the big ones, and I just grabbed this, that comes up a lot, are fidgets. So fidgets can be really helpful for some students and then drive the student next to them crazy. And you want it to be about the learning goal and learning for the community, because we don't learn and exist in isolation, even though it feels like it in COVID and remote learning. We don't in isolation. So really being able to have that conversation, okay, this is what's helping you do your best learning, but it also has to be mindful of those around you. And so coming up with like, and this is where you're setting, and you all know this, you're setting those classroom routines from the very beginning, so important. And then being able to, you know, and students will test it, which is great. That's what they should do. You know, how much is this going to push? And keeping it coming back to, you know, is it in service of the goal? And how is that working with our classroom culture? And how are we sharing and building on the different pathways we're each taking toward the learning goal? And that conversation, UDL can really have a big impact on that feeling and that culture of flexibility.
Yeah, I thank you. I like the idea of like emphasizing those two pieces, the goal and that we're functioning within a community.
Yeah.
Even if online in our separate corners,
Mm-hmm.
we're still in a learning community.
And in some ways, we get to learn a lot about our students by being able to have a little glimpse into their homes. Like right now, I have to say, it's really engaging to see some of the artwork that's up, or some of the screen examples that, like, I'm seeing Sue's dog on there. Like, we might get to have conversations around, you know, how are you making the design of your learning space that you have right now in service of your learning? You know, what's working well, what's not working well? How do you keep things organized? How do you may listen to music or not? And I think it can make it a really rich conversation, because kids are in a lot of times their own spaces, as opposed to having to come into ours that's comfortable for us.
Great.
It'd be
Cool.
really
Thank you.
Yeah, super interesting. Oh no, and there's a fidget tool warning system. Oh, that's hysterical to have as a third point reference. That's great. That's great. Good. Okay, so thank you all. So here, when we think about designing with UDL, Michelle, this will kind of support what you were asking too. These are kind of the 3 steps. The first is we have to really isolate and think about our learning goal. That can take up the most time, because often we have so many goals. Like, we want them to work in groups. We also want them to learn the content. We want them to also, you know, there's a lot we try to pack in. And we've actually heard with remote learning that it's really required educators to say what's most important. And that's the way UDL has always functioned. Like, let's kind of get rid of some of the superfluous stuff that we really don't need. You know, do they really need to, you know, make a cereal box to show what they know about explorers? You know, if the goal is to know about explorers, the cereal box and decorating and making the, you know, that might be optional. So kind of thinking about what is the real goal. And then you try to anticipate the barriers. Where do you reteach? Where do students get stuck? And students often share this with you, right? They might be like, Mrs. Posey, do I have to do the reading? Right there, I might be like, ding, 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 that's a barrier, is the reading. And I might say, is the goal for them to decode and work on reading? If it is, then yes, they need to read, and I can provide some options to help them. But if the goal isn't about the reading, if the goal is about them understanding the content, then they could have it read aloud. They could watch a video. They could talk about it with a friend. Then reading doesn't have to be embedded into it. So again, really knowing the learning goal is what allows us to anticipate the barriers. And even think about, where are you reteaching? And where are you like, why are they just not getting it? UDL will make us say, how can we design to support them to get at it? And then the fun comes in because we get to design some flexible options. A lot of this we already do. None of the tools or strategies are new. UDL has no new toolbox of, it's all of our best tried and true practices, just organized along the learning brain. So I thought I would just give you a quick example, one that was really powerful for me when I was first learning about UDL. And it was an example from elementary school. I believe it was a 3rd grade classroom. And the teacher was giving a spelling test. How many of you give spelling tests or have taken a spelling test? So the goal, you need to really think about the goal. The goal was to know if students could spell the word list. And the way it was done was she had students fold a lined piece of paper in half, number 1 through 20 on the left side, skipping sides. Listen to the teacher say the word in the example, and then spell the word using their pencil. And she wanted them to use pencil so that they could erase completely if they wanted to change their answer. So now I want you to think for a moment about potential barriers in the design of this little moment, this small mini assessment here. What are some of the barriers? And feel free to just put them in the chat. If you want to mute, unmute. Yeah, there are a number of them, right? Yep. These are great. The folding, the numbering, skipping lines, listening, processing, the speed to do all of that, hearing ability, the processing, the fine motor skills. And we really have to pause and reflect, which of those do we want to develop, right? It's not that any of these are bad, but there was a student in this teacher's class who didn't get any of the words right. So on the assessment scored a 0 out of 20. But when she knew this kid knew how to spell words. So she said, can you say how to spell these words out loud? And he got all 20 correct. So then it's really interesting to think, okay, if we had a student getting 0 out of 20, what would be the remediation that we might do? What would we potentially, what message is the kid getting? Versus really thinking about, what is it that I want to focus on for this moment? It's not that we never want the kid to write. It's just right now, if we're really wanting to assess spelling ability, and the best way for the kid to do it is to spell it out loud, you could have a spelling champion on your hands, and you wouldn't have known it if they only had one way to express it. So it's really asking us to think deeply about the options that we give to students or don't give to students, and what we risk thinking about what we think we're assessing, or the students thinking about their skill and ability. So yeah, and another thought is you could maybe have a template already made that's numbered and spaced. So you give that out. So that reduces all of those barriers, not to mention a huge time saver. Because I've been in some of those classes and it's painful waiting and watching, and you're the kid who's like, oh my gosh, I'm the slowest one and I'm trying to write my numbers and I'm messing up and I'm getting more anxious as that happens, and that takes cognition offline. When you start to get nervous like that, that's going to reduce your chances of being able to best show what you know. So again, sometimes these are really simple strategies. They're nothing new, they're nothing magical, but just thinking about how we're using them and when we're making them available can be really powerful. So any questions about this example, the spelling test example? Hoping you might already be like, oh, this is giving me an idea for something that I could do.
Can you go back to that slide? I was trying to read it. Sorry.
Yeah, oops, sorry, yep. The processing. This slide here.
One more.
One more, yes. Kind of having that goal, anticipating the barriers, and then thinking about some design options. And these are
Thank you.
connecting options to express and communicate. Oh, awesome, awesome. Yes, and Tracy is noting something. When we start to anticipate barriers now, we're also having to anticipate online barriers. So the way we're thinking about barriers differs from context to context, which is why, as I'm processing, I know in my kids' district here, they're thinking about doing a week face-to-face and then a week remote. The way you think about barriers face-to-face is different than how you're thinking about them remote. So it's just, you're still thinking through the same process. What are the goals? What are the barriers? How can we design to reduce them? But we're thinking about two totally different contexts. And so the way that we do this may be the same, but it may need to be a little different.
One
I
of
wish
the
I
other
had a magic toolbox for you. Go ahead. Is someone gonna?
one of my issues with all the trauma around coronavirus and the economy grinding to a halt is that my personal processing time has just gone haywire, trauma brain. And
Yeah.
so if I understand my processing time has changed, I wonder what happens to the kids.
Thank you for saying this. And actually, in the session that I had yesterday, we got into this conversation a little more if you do end up wanting to watch that recording of that, because we really started talking about how when you have an emotional anything that you're carrying around, it literally takes up cognitive energy. And so if you're fearful that your cough or your sneeze is going to get your friends sick or your teacher sick, that absolutely is going to have an impact on how you're learning and engaging in that classroom. So you are exactly right. There are layers and layers to this, and it is going to require that we think in more flexible ways. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yeah.
We had a student that lost their house in the Tubbs fire, and they just rebuilt, and 2 days ago they lost their grandfather to COVID. And there's 5 of the kids, and they're all different ages, and they're all in our district.
And we know they will not, they're not going to need what, there is no average. So when we look at what we know about the brain science, there is no average student. There is going to be variability for so many reasons. What you're describing is one, and actually this is I am going to hop a little bit here. Because one of the examples that I did want to share is a lot more people are saying we want to do social emotional check-ins with students. But I do want to, again, in the spirit of thinking about flexible options for expression and communication, if I were to ask all of you right now to share how you're doing, how many of you are really going to tell me? You know, what are the odds of that student really wanting to be like, yeah, let me just share. Guess what, guys? Like and I'm sorry, I'm not, even often with family members. So again, the goal of having SEL check-ins is so important. But we cannot ask students to do it in the same way and at the same time. We won't know if we expect it in that way. So being able to have flexible ways and I'll go back to the story of my son. It may mean that you need to open up texting, or you may need to have some private back channel or email, I'll share, there are so many different tools that you can take a look at. There's voice threads, even TikTok, Slack back channels, different ways of presenting and PowerPoints, answer gardens, podcasts. through dance and movement and art, videos. I mean, there's so many, and I know the younger the students are, the less they may know how to do all of these. I don't even know how to do all of these. And so you might pick one or two things that you might start to share with students at the beginning of the year. So you have access to these. I don't want to end up going down, we only have a couple minutes left, but you know, really being able to think about how can we leverage some of these different tools so students can share with us, you know, can share with us, and even scaffolding. You know, here are some sentence starters. Here's a template. Here's a model example. You know, here's something, and you yourself being vulnerable sometimes and saying, you know, here's something that I do want to share, and something else has happened that I don't want to share, and that's okay. You know, here are the different places that you can go. That kind of modeling, sentence starters, templates, examples of even, you know, when Tom Hanks came on, I don't know if you all saw when he had COVID and he was in quarantine, seeing him and having him share, and someone shared with him a Wilson volleyball even, you know, that was from his movie Castaway. For me, made it less scary to think about quarantine. Here's Tom Hanks doing this. So really thinking about how we can leverage all of these UDL guidelines, the emotion ones, building background, and the actual physical taking action in order to support students to be able to share how they're feeling, how they're doing, so we can get at learning. I mean, we know that if the emotions aren't there, the learning won't happen. So we can't expect them just, you know, tuck that away. We have to be able to have these opportunities for them to share. And just as a really quick example here, this was done by an art teacher who used to have students do a self-portrait, and they wanted it to convey something about themselves. And they started to give some flexibility, so it didn't have to just be an accurate self-portrait of the person. And they realized one of the biggest barriers was the actual drawing of the human. So they tried to open it up a little bit, the goal, and say this could be an imaginary space where anything's possible. This could be a place where you can be exactly who you want to be. Or this could be a space where you can deepen a vision of who you are. And they said you can do it in any way you want. You don't have to just draw. Like you could even, you know, trace your, you know, your face if you want to. And what they got was so much more rich. It was just, it was inspiring, and it focused on the self-portrait in such a deeper way. And the barrier wasn't in trying to draw the human or being terrified that what looks like Allison Posey is not what comes out on the piece of paper. So this can happen in any classroom, anywhere. And I know we're at time. We could talk about this all day. Here are resources for you. Know that these small changes can make such a significant difference. So share them with each other, rely on your colleagues, share it with each other, because you'll need these too. You'll need these strategies just as much. And so I do invite you to take a moment to think about what resonates, what questions you may have, and what next step that you might want to take. And we have a lot more resources, so please, you know, take these PowerPoints, this PowerPoint, and make it your own. Keep in touch. This is my email, and I'm also on Twitter. As you know, like I love thinking about this and brainstorming it, because we're keeping our students in mind as we do this. So please, you know, reach out at any point, and I'm more than happy to connect with you. And I've seen some familiar faces and names, so great to connect. Have a great conference. Thank you for doing what you're doing, and good luck this fall.